Conversation already in progress here on twitch.tv/ESPN1320, youtube.com/ESPN1320. We welcome in to the radio audience and the Odyssey streaming audience, Chris Biderman, our 1320 49ers insider, Sacramento Bee, of course, co-host of Candlestick Chronicles as well with Kyle Madsen, available wherever you get podcasts from. And we were laughing about how the last year we've essentially thrown away a year of content that we got 73 minutes out of with Trey Lance. And then we discussed, gosh, are we just doing this all again moving forward? And you threw out the idea, like, what if Jimmy plays well? Is there a scenario that Jimmy Garoppolo is back as the San Francisco 49ers quarterback? And I guess the first question would be, is that even financially possible?
Yeah, I mean, they would have to get creative, I would think, right? And it all kind of depends on who they can restructure, what Nick Bosa's contract's going to look like, if they can restructure Deebo Samuel's contract. Obviously, George Kittle, Fred Warner, Trent Williams, those guys all have big contracts. I do believe that they could figure out a way to make it work if they had to. But obviously, that's putting the cart before the horse. We need to see what Jimmy Garoppolo looks like as a quarterback this year, because as much equity as I think Jimmy Garoppolo has and the 49ers have as a team in all of our minds, it's far from a sure thing that they are going to make another deep playoff run this year, right? Like, I think they're certainly talented enough, and if they stay healthy, that should be the expectation, of course. But again, Jimmy Garoppolo is not going to be less injury prone at this point in his career than he's been previously, coming off an offseason in which he had shoulder surgery, a lengthy recovery. And, seeing him in the locker room, like, he's a smaller guy than he was last year. Like, it's pretty clear he wasn't able to lift weights in the same way that he has in previous seasons because of that shoulder injury. So, if Jimmy Garoppolo stays healthy and the 49ers do go on a deep playoff run, it becomes a very interesting situation because, is Kyle Shanahan going to look back on the way these last few months went and say, yeah, let's just hand it over to Trey. Let's make that. Or would he say, well, maybe I should test Trey a little bit more with the quarterback competition in training camp? If Jimmy even wants to come back, Jimmy has full control next offseason, so he could play really well. He's got a no tag clause. The 49ers couldn't give him the franchise tag even if they wanted to. So we could go hit the open market. But the other side of that too is, like, Jimmy Garoppolo clearly likes being here and understands that he can have success on this team. So, like, what is he going to want to do? So obviously how the rest of the season plays out is going to shape this conversation. But in terms of Trey Lance, to your point, it's like, man, the conversation really doesn't change for another year now. Like, we're going to be saying the same exact things about Trey Lance. We were so excited to see what this looks like and see if this process the 49ers went through was going to pay off. And now we're just kicking the can down the road at another, 8 to 12 months or however long it's going to take. So it's an interesting situation, and certainly not one the 49ers would have preferred, obviously, given that injury.
Yeah, that changes a lot and opens up a lot of questions. First of all, what's going on, Chris? My main man, Chris Biderman.
What's up, Kenny? How are you?
But yeah, I look at it like this, Chris, and maybe I'm just too committed to the process. Okay, maybe that's the case with me. I'm just too committed to the process. And the process was you drafted Trey Lance to be your franchise quarterback. All right. He'll be back next year. You have a part of the reason why you brought him back or drafted him and tried to groom him to be the franchise quarterback is money-wise as well. You had to get Bosa, you had to get Samuels, Kittles, Fred Warner, all these guys. Had to take care of them. I'm staying committed to the process, and there's two things that could happen here. Number one, the 49ers win the Super Bowl. And at that point, I will thank Jimmy Garoppolo. He will never pay for another meal from Fresno all the way up to Chico. He'll never pay for another bill or another meal. But I'll be like, thank you. All right. Good luck on your future endeavors. Or they don't win the Super Bowl and they get maybe where they've been the last couple of years or a little short. And the answer will, the conversation will be, well, Jimmy's not good enough. Like, he's not good enough to get you there. So it's pretty simple to me. Trey Lance, now, whether you have somebody else competing with him or not, but he's QB1 at the start of next season.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think ultimately that's the best way to do it because like the reason they went and made the swing for Trey Lance was they looked at the rest of the league and realized, all right, we're going to have to beat Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Aaron Rodgers, like these super talented quarterbacks that can win outside the structures of their respective offense based on pure talent, right? Like these are just very talented quarterbacks, and that bar has been raised because I think ultimately we know Kyle Shanahan believed at one point he could win enough with Kirk Cousins. Like he could successfully win with Kirk Cousins or a player like that. And now with the rise of Mahomes and Allen and even Matt Stafford being in the division, that level of quarterback that you need to beat to win championships has gone to a different level. So it was a bet on, okay, we can develop this talent and maybe we could develop Trey Lance to become one of those guys. So yeah, I mean, I would think that's not going to change. Like Jimmy Garoppolo isn't suddenly going to ascend to one of those guys, right? Like he's not more mobile. He's not going to develop a stronger arm. He's not going to become like a top 5 quarterback. He's going to be who he is in all likelihood, right? Like he's going to be a guy who's the 12th to 25th best quarterback in the league, depending on the week. And when you get to the playoffs, it becomes much harder to win with that type of quarterback. And the 49ers have learned that in 2 of the last 3 seasons, right? So, yeah, I think it would make sense absolutely to just, no matter what happens with Jimmy this year, just kind of move on and then pave the way for Trey. But at the same time, like when's Trey going to be able to practice, right? Is he going to be back for OTAs? Like that's still a question mark. Is he going to have the same confidence? Like is his ankle, going to prevent him from coming back in a way that, he's not thinking about it? Are there going to be any residual effects from the ankle injury? Those are things we just don't know yet. And so, we saw Dak Prescott come back from his ankle injury, which was a little bit worse, but Dak Prescott obviously had a much larger resume, much more robust resume to pull from, right? Like he knew he could be a winning quarterback in the NFL, whereas Trey Lance is like, well, we all think he can get there, but there were enough questions in Kyle Shanahan's mind to say, well, we don't really trust you to pass it a whole lot just yet. We still are going to, rely on your legs to run the ball a lot because we're worried about your accuracy, right? Like we're worried about how efficient of a passer you can be on this team that has to win now. So is that going to change in a year? Like that's kind of the biggest question in my mind. Like how is Kyle Shanahan going to feel about Trey Lance a year from now? And is it going to be all that different from what we saw in week 1 and week 2, where it was, pretty clear that he didn't trust him and was Kyle Shanahan right to think that way? I mean, we can debate that. I would say, given the fact that Trey Lance never really learned how to protect himself at North Dakota State in terms of him running the ball, and the fact that the first time he slid in a game, he said, was in that Packers preseason game. To me, that's like, why are you running a guy 13 times a game if he can't protect himself? And ultimately, that to me is where the conversation should be about Trey and Kyle Shanahan in terms of Shanahan running him. I'm not saying it's like a fireable offense like a lot of people are in terms of, Shanahan running Trey out there and all of that. But I just think like Trey Lance needs to be able to protect himself and learn how to do that. And now he's not going to be able to learn how to do that. Is he going to develop as a passer next year? Like that's a very big question mark because now obviously his progression is going to be on hold for the foreseeable future while he recovers from this ankle injury.
Do you blame Kyle's play calling at all?
So I think you have to utilize Trey Lance's athleticism and his running to a certain extent. You look back at, the way the 49ers used Colin Kaepernick in 2012 and 2013, he was averaging about 5 to 6 carries a game. And he obviously had that 16 carry game in the playoffs against the Packers where they just couldn't stop him at all. And that was a very clear outlier, right? Trey Lance was averaging over 12 carries in his starts. And not all of those were design carries. Some of those were scrambles. But to me, he never proved that he was a good enough runner to be like a centerpiece of the rushing offense. I think that was pretty clear by anybody who watched. Mm-hmm. And I go back to his inability to protect himself. He's a guy who, when he was playing at North Dakota State, was lowering his shoulder into all the defenders he was going against, right? And he even said before the Seahawks game, he can't do that in the NFL, and he's still learning about, how to protect himself against players who are bigger, faster, stronger than he is. And, Trey Lance is not a small guy, but 225 pounds, like, Josh Allen's bigger than all the linebackers he's going against. He's stiff arming those dudes, right? Mm-hmm. Trey Lance is not an experienced enough runner to be able to protect himself, or really that good of a runner to be the centerpiece of this running game in the way Kyle Shanahan was using him, given the volume of runs he was getting. So I would quibble with that. I would say, yeah, if you want to give Trey Lance 4 or 5 carries a game just to keep defenses honest, that absolutely makes sense. But when he's getting 12 and 13, that's where I would push back and say, you really got to develop this guy. And obviously a big part of developing him is keeping him healthy. And, so far, I know it's a fluke play, but like the 49ers were unable to do that. They're unable to keep Trey Lance healthy. I don't know that there's one person to blame for that, but if it were me, and I've never developed a quarterback before, so I'm not trying to like say I'm smarter than Kyle Shanahan, but I would say like, I think the 4 to 5 runs a game is a better sweet spot than like 12 and 13.
All right. And I talked about it before. I don't even like design quarterback runs. Like I like, you got your Kylers that the things break down and they're able to scramble and make plays that way. But even with Lamar, like I get nervous seeing him in designed runs. That's just me by nature. I'm just not a big fan of him.
Well, Lamar's an elite runner, right? Like, and that was apparent in college. He was an elite runner. Josh Allen is, I would say, an elite runner. Even watching Jalen Hurts, like in that Eagles game on Monday night, he knows how to protect himself. Like he can get down and avoid some of these big hits. And I think ultimately, like, that's probably an indictment of Kyle Shanahan sort of at large, is like, you look at all the running backs and even Deebo Samuel, like he loves guys who are just trying to run through brick walls whenever they can. Whereas like the difference would obviously be Frank Gore, who one of his elite traits and maybe his most underrated ability was to get down and avoid big hits. And it's obviously a big reason why his career lasted so long, is because he didn't subject himself to big hits, because he knew when plays were over and when to avoid taking those hits. And Kyle Shanahan's guys, like, I don't think it's an accident that you see so many of these running backs get hurt. And yeah, I mean, like Deebo Samuel and George Kittle, obviously, right? Like those guys are relentless. They're trying to run through defenders' faces, which is admirable to a certain point. But also, like, if you're trying to keep these guys healthy, you might have to rein that back a little bit. And I do wonder if that's a philosophical thing with Shanahan. Like, yeah, you obviously want really aggressive runners and you want those guys to be who they are, because that's a big, a really important characteristic for the offense. But it's also like, you need these guys to be healthy. So I do wonder if there's an element of that with Trey Lance. Like, yeah, maybe you want to rush him and utilize his athleticism, but you also want to make sure he's protecting himself so he can obviously stay on the field.
Yeah.
You're listening to D'Lo and Casey on KIFM West Sacramento, 98.5 FM, KRXQ, HD2 Sacramento, ESPN 1320, driven by Lashers, Elk Grove Dodge, always live on the free Odyssey app, our 1320 49ers insider, Chris Biderman of the Sacramento Bee with us here. Looks like George Kittle is back. I've got some uneasy vibes headed into this game against the Denver Broncos, because I feel like Denver's really trying to figure some things out, especially offensively. And they've got the boogeyman, as Kenny Caraway refers to Russell Wilson as. And it's like, man, I think very, very highly of the San Francisco 49ers defense, but I wonder how much of what they're going to see on Sunday has actually been on film, because I feel like Denver's kind of searching right now.
Yeah, Denver's a big unknown because, they're ingratiating a new quarterback, a new head coach, really an entirely new system. They have new ownership, right? So like they're a big unknown, and I would say it doesn't seem great for Nathaniel Hackett right now. Like it's really hard to look around the league and feel. I think if you're looking around the league and say, what is a coach I just really don't feel good about, I would probably say Nathaniel Hackett tops that list for me. In large part because he's new and he doesn't have a resume to fall back on, but also like it's looked ugly, right? Like there just been procedural things that the Seahawks haven't been good at. But to your point, like, yeah, it's a potentially a scary game because maybe at some point it is going to click for them, right? And maybe those first 2 weeks were kind of a feeling out period. There's a general feeling in the NFL that September is often an extension of the preseason, right? So maybe that's what Denver's going through, or maybe they're just kind of a disaster. Like I think that's on the table with them because Russell Wilson isn't running like he used to. That video where he's yelling at his teammates like to call out the pass and the runs, like I don't know, man. I don't know if I would respond very well to that if that was the $200 million quarterback on my new team. Like, so yeah, I think Denver on paper, really talented roster, obviously some skill guys, some really talented guys on defense. But they don't have that foundation and they're still trying to figure things out. And we talk all the time about like continuity. The 49ers are going to have an advantage in continuity over a lot of the teams that they play because Kyle Shanahan's been there for so long, because so many of those players have been there for so long. So with George Kittle coming back, playing with Jimmy Garoppolo, it's going to, for those guys, that's old hat, right? It's not going to be really any sort of adjustment for Kittle. But I do wonder if the Broncos are going to be the team where, all right, they finally got it in gear this week, or their issues from the first 2 weeks where they were really a disaster in Seattle against a bad team that they should have beat and sort of barely beat a Houston team that's obviously not going to be very good or not expected to be very good. Like, is that the team they're going to be, or are they going to be a team that gets better as the season goes? And this is a turning point for them. That's one of the things that makes this game fun. And a lot of these early season games fun is you don't know what these teams are, who they're going to be. So it makes it really difficult to figure out going into each week.
Did you see it was an emergency situation and things were happening on the fly, but did you see anything different from the 49ers offense last week when Jimmy Garoppolo got in there as opposed to maybe what they were doing with Trey? I know obviously Trey's first 2 drives, they ran it a lot, but once they settled in maybe in that second half, kind of looked about the same to me. Did you see anything different between the two offenses?
As soon as Jimmy came in, it was pass. After they ran a lot, which I feel like was pretty telling. But no, you talk to the guys in the locker room, and they said the game plan was pretty much the same. They didn't really go off script in terms of the playbook and what they were planning to run going in. And Jimmy Garoppolo said that there were some plays that he had never run before that were obviously designed for Trey Lance that he was able to execute. But no, I didn't think it was all that different. Like it looked, like Kyle Shanahan knows exactly how to utilize Jimmy Garoppolo and how to run a Jimmy Garoppolo led offense with a lot of quick passes, with spreading the ball around. I did think they played pretty well in the running game. I thought the offensive line looked a lot better. Aaron Banks had a really nice game, both on the ground and in pass protection, which is obviously a really good sign for them because they need the interior of the offensive line to be good. Yeah. But no, it didn't look all that different. It was it was jarring how familiar it felt, to be honest, because it's like, oh, this is this team that we've watched, these last 4 years. Like, this is what it looks like. So yeah, it didn't look all that different, and I'm expecting it to be pretty in rhythm on Sunday. I think Deebo Samuel's going to get a lot more, like slant passes. It's not going to be just sort of screens and jet sweeps and things like that we've seen from him. I'm expecting Brandon Ayuk maybe to get a few more looks. Mm-hmm. And, we'll see with George Kittle. It seems like depending on the matchup, George Kittle's a guy who will either get 12 targets or 2 or 3 because, they're just determined to run the ball down people's throats. So that'll be interesting to see. But in terms of the way the offense looked, to me, it was just familiar, and it was it was jarring because it wasn't expected, obviously, because we're all expecting Trey Lance to be in there.
Speaking of running the ball, how excited are you on a scale from 9 to 10 for Tevin Coleman's return?
Is he going to be activated? I don't know. Like,
I don't know.
He's on the practice squad. I think it's going to be a lot of Marlon Mack, a lot of Jeff Wilson Jr., obviously. But yeah,
what was the Friday night bet? The over under, was it 40 carries on the season?
Man, you're asking me to remember things.
Is Friday night a little hazy for you?
Friday night is a little hazy, yeah, because
I believe the post panel bet was, does Marlon Mack get 40 carries on the season?
Yeah, I'll take the over.
I think the over is super confident now that the 49ers they're losing on average a running back per week.
Yeah, it could be that Marlon Mack's a starter going into the next week. Is that what, Monday night against the Rams? Marlon Mack
Yeah.
starting nine running back.
Yeah. Marlon Mack bobblehead night. It's a big
It's
night.
possible. It's possible. Kyle Shanahan has not had a repeat leading running back in all 5 of his seasons with the 49ers.
That's
It's been
amazing.
a different guy each year. And, it's like, it's so weird because they're typically one of the best running teams in the league. But, you go like fantasy wise, it's always like, who's it going to be this week? People ask me, I'm like, I don't know. Like, your guess is as good as mine, like Jeff Wilson Jr. And then it ends up being, Ty Davis Price or whatever. So, but yeah, with Elijah Mitchell and Ty Davis Price out now for the foreseeable future, it's going to be incumbent on Jeff Wilson to stay healthy. And obviously they're going to need to run the ball because we know that's a staple of Kyle Shanahan's offense and really the engine that makes everything else work.
Wow. Chris, what you thinking about this game, man? I feel confident about this game. And ironically, like we've been asking the question all week about, did the Niners get better with Jimmy there or Trey or whatever? I feel the same. I think this is a good team either way, whether it was Trey or Jimmy under center. And I feel good specifically about this defense who's looking elite. And I just feel good about this game on Sunday night, man. What you thinking?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. It was funny. We're talking about it. I was talking about it with Kyle, like all this crazy stuff has happened at quarterback, but ultimately it doesn't really change my level of optimism for this team, like about the season as a whole. Right. And I think it's fair to make the point that like, yeah, the 49ers might be better right now with Jimmy Garoppolo, but obviously the goal with Trey Lance as a starter would have been, all right, he gets more experience, he gets better and better. And then maybe you get a version of Trey Lance at quarterback if you make the playoffs that lifts the ceiling of the offense and allows you to compete with those other quarterbacks you mentioned earlier. But in terms of Sunday, like I'm with you. I think this defense might be the best defense in the league. And I think they are sick and tired of Russell Wilson and answering questions about Russell Wilson and, like him being the quote unquote boogeyman that they have to deal with. Like he's just not as mobile. And if he's not mobile, we've seen the 49ers struggle against mobile quarterbacks, right? Like that's a thing that's been prevalent over the last few years. Russ is not that mobile. Nick Bosa is one of the best players in the league. Fred Warner is arguably the best linebacker in the league. The secondary is a lot better. Talanoa Hufanga looks like a Pro Bowler, if not an All-Pro after 2 weeks, and albeit against, Geno Smith and Justin Fields. So I don't want to anoint him just yet, but given that he's making plays behind the line of scrimmage and also downfield and getting his hands on a lot of passes, like that's a really promising development for them.
Right.
I think the defense is really good. And I think if the defense plays like it has the first 2 weeks, aside from the penalties and blown coverages in Chicago, they're going to be a really, really tough team to beat at home or on the road. So yeah, I'm with you. Like, I think the 49ers win Sunday in Denver, and we all kind of, the conversation is like, yeah, they're probably fine with Jimmy. Like it wasn't their plan A, but they're probably good enough to be considered one of the top teams in the NFC, given the NFC is generally pretty wide open. And we are talking about a team that went to the NFC title game last year with a quarterback who was dealing with multiple injuries, right? So I think that's my expectation is coming out of this game. That's how we're going to frame the conversation around the 49ers is like, oh yeah, this is the same team more or less that has been pretty successful in 2 of the last 3 years.
Yeah,
great stuff, Chris. We appreciate you, man, as always.
No problem. Appreciate you guys.